Next, a second economy story, this one about the fine line the Federal Reserve is walking. The Fed announced today it plans to keep interest rates at record low levels of near zero for an extended period of time. Well, our economics correspondent, Paul Salmon, examines that strategy as part of his continuing reporting on making sense of financial news.
As we go through this recession,
investment advisor John Shane under his nom de country, Merle Hazard, on the Federal Reserve's monetary ministrations to revive the economy.
It's a mini Great Depression. Our markets went berserk. The Fed is printing trillions now, but will their efforts work?
Will Fed policy, that is, made every 6 weeks in this room, pull us out of the downturn so prices, wages, and consumers don't start drooping again? The extreme case it's looking to avoid, Japan these past 20 years, and its so-called Great Deflation.
We're terrible poor. New class. Working poor.
Or might the Fed, by printing too much money in order to keep interest rates low and the economy ticking, ultimately be driving us in the very opposite direction, toward inflation? The extreme example of the moment, hyperinflationary Zimbabwe.
By December, you needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a bread. By January, a loaf of bread and things like tomatoes were costing millions. By April, it was billions.
Merle Hazard puts the Fed's plight as starkly as possible.
Inflation or deflation, tell me if you can. Will we become Zimbabwe, or will we be Japan?
Now, over the past year or so, the Fed has been far more worried about deflation and depression. So it's voted to create more than $1 trillion worth of new money.
And this is where it all takes place.
The New York Fed's Brian Sack back in July, doing the bidding of the D.C. Fed to create as much as it took to get the economy back off the mat.
The directive that the Federal Open Market Committee gave to the trading desk here at the New York Fed was to purchase up to $1.75 trillion.
$1.75 trillion, which the Fed has since used to buy bonds from banks. They, in return, have been getting electronic money, Federal Reserves. Buying or selling bonds is how the Fed actually does its main job, managing interest rates. The more dollars created to buy up bonds, the lower the interest rate the government is forced to pay on the bonds. The lower the interest rate, the easier it is for people and businesses to borrow and spend. Since the Fed's digital dollars are hopelessly untelegenic, we're stuck with this U.S. mint footage instead. But the rates have been near zero for a year now, and that has critics like John Taylor issuing a warning.
How should the central bank, Fed in our country, set the interest rate so as to get the best performance possible?
In his introductory economics course at Stanford a few weeks ago, John Taylor explained his so-called Taylor rule, a formula which guides the Fed when setting interest rates.
And it basically says that if inflation's rising, they should raise the interest rate. If the economy's going into a recession, they should cut the interest rate, and more importantly, by how much.
The key is those last three words, by how much. Taylor's rule is an actual equation.
R is the federal funds rate, P is the inflation rate, Y is the real GDP gap.
It's a bit of a slog for a news show, but simple in its effect. Restraining the Fed from creating too much money when, like now, it keeps interest rates at rock-bottom lows.
So the problem with the Fed is, yes, you stimulate the economy when it's in the doldrums, but you can get carried away.
Absolutely, and we have. And we saw in the great inflation period in the 70s, we got carried away. We just had interest rates much too low compared to what they would be.
That was the era in which Fed Chairman Paul Volcker famously choked off the money supply to hike interest rates and ended the great inflation of the 70s. For decades thereafter, claims John Taylor, the Fed had followed a moderate course. Then suddenly, around the year 2000, the Fed began to deviate, keeping interest rates too low for too long, ending in the crash of '08.
If I were to think about why, after 2 decades of good performance, starting with Volcker, going in through most of Greenspan's term, why there was the deviation. I think it's really trying to do too much, if you like. Things were working well, and if you're doing well, you try to do better.
Try to do better by boosting the economy with cheap money, thus setting the stage for the inevitable bust.
Busts are terrible, and the more the boom it gets out of hand, the worse the bust will be.
So it is really true that the higher you fly, the further you fall.
In general.
And that, Taylor argues, should be the worry today. That the Fed is again keeping rates too low for too long, fueling new bubbles and a future collapse. This time, perhaps an inflationary collapse of the U.S. dollar itself, given all the new dollars out there. The Fed, of course, has an answer. Don't be ridiculous. If we raise rates now, says Fed Chairman Bernanke, we choke off the recovery and head back down toward deflation, depression.
However, as the recovery strengthens, the time will come when it is appropriate to begin withdrawing the unprecedented monetary stimulus that is helping to support economic activity. For that reason, we've been giving careful thought to our exit strategy. We are confident that we have all the tools necessary to withdraw monetary stimulus in a timely and effective way.
As to what the Fed will do next,
any hints just between us on where interest rates might go?
Well, they can't go much further down.
So is Bernanke right or John Taylor? In the end, as always for the Fed, it's the same old question, the same old song.
Inflation or deflation, the choice is looking grim. I wonder what John Maynard Keynes would say if we asked him. Inflation or deflation, tell me if you can.
Will we be Zimbabwe or will we be Japan?
The answer the Fed is betting on? Neither.